Thank you so much for being here. I'm going to do my best attempt at taking a look at the state of U.S. housing today, April 14th, 2020. It's changing every day. I'm just going to talk about where we are now, and there's a lot more to it, so I'll probably have to do a part two. But just appreciate you being here and hearing what I have to say. What I'm going to basically do is compare where we are today as to where we were just a few months ago, and some of the predictions. So if you saw my forecast for 2020, I used to say, and I said in that presentation, that I don't actually have a crystal ball. But now I do. It's not true anymore. My husband bought me a crystal ball, so I can't say it anymore. I actually have one. I just don't know how to use it yet. So what that means is I'm just putting together some slides that I've been looking at over the past few years, comparing it to now, and using our best guess, best predictions on where things are headed. So the pre-COVID-19 economy. Again, if you listen to my 2020 forecast back in January, then these are just some of the slides I showed back then. And one of the things that we had seen was this exponential growth of the US GDP. So you see that coming back from the 50s and just growing with a few blips. You can see on the screen these lines are recessions, and there's a bit of a pause through each recession, but then more growth. Pause, more growth, much bigger, pause in the downturn, the Great Recession, but a continued growth. And then, of course, the U.S. economy, greatest economy in the world. This is what many people were saying, and things looked really good, of course. We saw the stock market up, real estate prices up. What my concern had been that all of that was true, but as I said in January, and as I've said over the past few years, there were some underlying issues that weren't necessarily being discussed as much, and that, of course, was the national debt. So yes, GDP growth was up, stock market up, real estate up, lots of spending, consumer confidence up, wage growth up, household growth up. All of that was true, but also this national debt up in the same way. So let's go back to that slide. Look at this. US GDP growth, debt growth. So it appears from this slide that, the more debt we get, that seems to have an impact on growth, which is true. I mean, you look at real estate, we borrow money to buy assets, and that ends up making lots of people wealthy. So if you use debt properly, it can be a good thing. The question is, have we been? So this was my concern. It's been my concern for the last few years that what we were seeing had some really serious underlying issues that we weren't really talking about. Some people were, but not everybody. So where did all this debt come from? Well, this is another slide of what they call the money stock, basically the money supply, money that's circulating. And look at that, it's the same exponential growth. So where did all this money come from that can create all this debt, that can create all this growth? Now, this is no longer conspiracy theory. This is from the Federal Reserve website and history. There was a meeting at Jekyll Island in 1910, a secret gathering at a secluded island off the coast of Georgia in 1910 that laid the foundations of the Federal Reserve System. It was just 6 men that gathered together and created the Federal Reserve. If you want to really understand what happened there, a great book is The Creature from Jekyll Island by Edward Griffin. Very good read, very long. If you've got lots of free time at home and not much to do, then I recommend reading this book. I personally couldn't put it down, but it's really to understand what this Federal Reserve is and how it has affected our economy. And too many people just don't understand it because it's very difficult to understand. But here's what we know is that the Federal Reserve's balance sheet basically is this. Look at that. It was fairly low. And then, of course, after the last banking recession, the mortgage crisis, we know there was this new word created called quantitative easing. And basically, that was really just creating more money, which the Federal Reserve was created to do, create more liquidity. So it did, and in unprecedented ways, to bring us back out of that massive recession. And then things, came back. We had a booming economy as a result of all that money creation. I should hope so. If you pour trillions of dollars into an economy, you should hope that there's some kind of reaction to it. And we saw that. We saw the economy come roaring back. And then there was talk, if you recall, about unloading some of that, for the Federal Reserve to unload some of the assets that it had bought during that time to create more liquidity. And then we suddenly had a slowdown again. So our economy actually couldn't handle even the slightest bit of selling off or balancing the assets of the Federal Reserve. So that already was concerning to me back in 2018 when things started to slow down. It was about 2018 that the discussion was, time to balance the assets of the Federal Reserve and unload some of those. So there were already some issues that we were seeing, and that the Federal Reserve and all this money creation maybe wasn't going to end so well, that, we already had low rates, incredibly low rates, and yet we weren't seeing such a growth in GDP. So what happened? Well, again, I've talked about this on so many of these webinars, but in 1971, Nixon took us off of the gold standard and basically gave the Federal Reserve sort of unlimited ability to create that money. And that's what happened. You can see here the debt to GDP, so debt to income, basically, what our country's producing versus the debt that we're taking on, has incrementally increased since that time when we were taken off the gold standard. So a lot of our growth, a lot of the GDP, a lot of what we're seeing and what we're calling a strong economy is really based on this debt. And the question is it bad debt or is it good debt? Because those of us in real estate, well, we love debt. Debt is what can make us wealthy. So is it making our country wealthy? What we do know is, again, that we've got a lot of debt compared to the output of that we're producing. And where will that end up? Well, already in 2019, before all of this, and this is what I talked about early, or early this year, before COVID was even a thing, nobody was talking about it really, at least not here in the U.S. We were already seeing a slowdown in GDP, while all the while people still believing that the economy was stronger than ever. So, but if you really looked at the growth, it was slowing down. Now you can see in 2017, GDP was high, and that probably had a lot to do with tax cuts. So anytime that we get some kind of fiscal stimulus, and it comes in many different ways. It comes in the form of low interest rates. It comes in the form of QE, repos that we saw last fall, and certainly in 2017, the tax cuts. Well, that usually works for a while, and it did, and then things slowed down again. So there was kind of need for another QE of some kind of stimulus. And I was questioning why last fall we were starting to see these repos where the Fed was already starting to notice liquidity issues. And I would ask around about it, and nobody seemed to really care. There were a few people, the real estate guys and Kiyosaki were talking about it, Peter Schiff, but in general, it wasn't discussed, certainly not in the headlines. But it was concerning to me. If our economy was so robust, why was the Fed having to come in and bring in more liquidity to the banks just starting last fall? So the bottom line is we were already seeing a slowdown. We were already seeing the Fed coming in and trying to rescue, basically. And then March came along, and wow, bam, everything just came to a screeching halt. Now, back in January, I had said, even though things look so good, there could be a black swan event that brings everything to a halt. So we've got to be really really careful in the decisions we make, because just historically speaking, every time there's a recession, people don't see it. They don't see it coming. And it's usually, every recession is preceded by just massive confidence. So there was massive confidence. And boy, many of us did not see this black swan, but I figured some kind of black swan would come. This one was gigantic. Never seen stadiums empty like this, restaurants closed across the country, schools closed, airplanes, airlines, airports closed. I mean, just unprecedented. And of course, that led to massive initial jobless claims. There's the black swan. You can see historically, we've never seen anything like this, not in our lifetimes. Again, these lines are recessions. Every time we saw a recession, we saw jobless claims, but boy, nothing like this. And this doesn't even include the most recent. So the neck of this one, it's going to be at the top here, initial jobless claims. So of course, it's because the economy was shut down and it was unprecedented. Here's the current unemployment rate. So even with the initial jobless claims, you got to remember that we had record low unemployment. So even with the jobless claims, you can see we're not quite up to where we've been in the past, but that could, of course, change rapidly. So to take care of that, of course, we saw the $2.2 trillion coronavirus aid package signed, meant to help the business owners and the people who lost their jobs. And that was, again, a stimulus. And stimuluses like these are what you do generally in a recession. And that is what happened. And again, it's the Federal Reserve coming in, creating that kind of money to be able to, bail out the economy again. In addition to that, the Federal Reserve takes additional actions to provide up to $2.3 trillion in loans. And this is especially interesting. The Fed goes all in with unlimited bond buying plan, unlimited. And there's been talk that it would be about $4 trillion. We don't really know. The Fed is very quiet about this. Ron Paul has been trying to audit the Fed for years because it's been kind of a secret group. As we saw, they met in secret in the early, 1900s, and it's still somewhat secret. And that's why Ron Paul was fighting so hard to be able to audit the Fed and find out. So we really don't even know how much they're going to spend and how much they're going to dump into the money supply. But we know it's unlimited at this point. So here's how typically markets react to that. Whenever there's a stimulus, at this, we've never seen anything of this size, but in the past, when we've seen a stimulus, it brought the economy up. I mean, look at after the last stimulus, the stock market dropped, created all this money, stock market went back up, and then it crashed from the COVID news, and then came back primarily because of the stimulus package and this sort of unlimited money. Now, why would that happen? Why would so many sort of gamble on the future based on the stimulus? Because generally speaking, when that much money is created, it drives asset prices up. It drives values up. The idea is to create inflation. The only reason you'd ever want to create inflation is if you're experiencing deflation. The Fed hates deflation more than inflation, basically. So the attempt at devaluing basically the dollar is to raise asset values. And, investors recognize that and they jump back into the stock market. That's why we kind of saw that rebound. So how will that affect the housing market? And again, remember, this is just my opinion, take it or leave it. So many opinions out there. I'm just giving you mine. Don't rely on it. Just look at the data and determine, how you will interpret it. So what about housing? How will this affect us in our industry? Again, it's kind of the same thing. We saw the median sales price go up after the last QE, But remember, housing is a slower moving vehicle than the stock market. So it takes a little longer to slow down and it can take a little longer to rev up. But over time, look at this again, since we went off that gold standard in 1970, it's just been a up, up, up because, again, so much more money is circulating and it tends to drive asset values up, historically speaking. We also know there's this stimulus. Interest rates are down again at new lows. And again, we haven't seen this. This is historical lows still. Look at that 30-year fixed rate mortgage. Never been this, well, it's been this low, but it's record lows. So that again is a form of stimulus. These are mortgages, and the only reason that mortgages, a 30-year fixed rate mortgage could ever be this low is that the government is backing it. The Fed is buying bonds to keep rates low. That's why it's unlimited. So there is tremendous effort to keep asset values up and to keep the housing market up. And that's important to understand that the US government does not want to see asset values fall. Deflation is an enemy. They're trying to create inflation, and some people are worried it will create runaway inflation, but really what they're trying to do is just prevent deflation right now. They don't want to see asset values go down, so they're just pouring everything at it, everything they can, and that's how important the housing market is to the US economy. And at the same time, the banks are saying, well, we don't want a loan if people don't have to pay their mortgage. So there's mixed messages going on where, there's this forbearance promises to people, hey, we know you lost your job, so you shouldn't have to pay your mortgage if you were forced to lose your job. No mistake that you made, you just don't get to work. So there's this mixed message of, hey, you don't have to pay your mortgage, but we still want to lend. But the banks are saying, well, we don't like that bargain, because if we're going to lend, we want to know that the mortgages are going to be paid. So this is what we're seeing across the board is the secondary market doesn't want to buy loans if there's this chance that people are just going to have the ability to have a forbearance and not have to pay them legally. So this is what we're seeing now across the board is JP Morgan saying, yep, nope, we're raising credit scores. We want down payments. This is going to be the new home loan standard if we're going to operate this way and if people aren't required to pay their mortgage. And then, of course, QM, this is anything that's not government backed. So anything not Fannie and Freddie or FHA, there just isn't a secondary market for that. There aren't the investors who feel comfortable in that market or the jumbo market. So all best efforts, and those are not government backed. They're not insured by the federal government. So those loans have really dried up as well because investors don't feel comfortable buying those. So really who's buying these loans? That's my dog snoring in the background. Sorry, I don't know if you can hear her. She's really loud. So this just kind of leaves Fannie and Freddie at this time. And even with Fannie and Freddie, it looks like credit scores are going up, and so are down payments. So this is kind of an interesting twist. Although if you read the article further, it does say that there still are loan programs available with lower, like the 3% down for low-income borrowers. I didn't copy that, but if you do read the article, you'll see there are still some low down payment options available. Again, Wells Fargo restricts jumbo loan program. So as much as the Fed is doing everything it can to keep lending afloat, some of the banks are pushing back because they don't want to go through what they went through in 2008. They don't ever want to do that again. That was a horrible time. So they're getting more cautious about lending. Now we're going to have a lender on tomorrow to talk about that and what's still available, and there are still loans available. It's just credit scores have to be higher. And that was kind of happening anyway. If you look at FICO scores and the loans that were made over the last 10 years, they were pretty high. The bulk of the loans were high FICO scores. So I'm not really sure it's going to change that much because they were already pretty picky and the requirements were pretty high, but except for FHA. So, we'll see how that plays out. But definitely banks are being cautious. Now, with all this in play, we know that we have a growing US population. This is basically a chart predicting population growth, but this is one that shows total US population by age in 2020. So you see very large Gen Z population. That's the youngsters, my 20-year-old, those born between 2000 and 2020. So we have a fairly large generation of young people, and that's good. A lot of other countries aren't experiencing that, like Europe and Japan. Millennials, still very large generation of fairly young people, 82 to 99. And then we've got the Gen X, a bit of a smaller population, but still 65 million is a lot of people. And then baby boomers that, wow, we used to be the biggest group, 1947 to 1965. Now I'm 64. Where do I fit on this chart? Okay, I don't know. Anyway, I think I'm the beginning of the baby boomer. But anyway, that baby boomer group used to be the largest, and you see it is shrinking. And really the millennials are still the largest group with a pretty large Gen Z group behind them. So again, that's good news for us in this country. What's interesting is that with the population growth that we've seen since the last recession, since 2006, well, so a little bit after it, 2006 to 2016, we had about 23 million more Americans during that time period, during the past decade. And interestingly enough, we also, out of that growth, the majority appears to be renters, or we had this much more renters. So Rent Cafe came out with this chart saying we had large population growth, but we also had an increase in rentership. So many of the people forming households, they were turning to rental. And that was during this robust economy, right? So for the past 10 years, we've had massive growth. And yet we still had massive growth in rentership. So why would that be? Where was the disconnect there? It comes back to what I talked about earlier, this consumer debt in general, debt all over the place. Consumer debt up. Oops, that slide is in the wrong place. This slide is supposed to be there. Of course, student loan debt. So many of these people that were forming households were forced to rent. And add to it that home prices had gone up so much because of the quantitative easing. As I mentioned earlier, whenever you have a lot of stimulus, it tends to drive asset values up, which would be stocks and real estate. Not all real estate. There's lots of different kinds of real estate, so you have to be very careful about the kind you pick. But in general, lots of monetary stimulus will drive values up, and that's what happened. So even if wages weren't going up at the same rate and debt was increasing, home prices were, so it made it very difficult for people to qualify for a loan, which is why we saw more rental demand. And this is what kind of the headlines we've been seeing is more and more people kind of forced to rent. And this is why at RealWealth we have, I try to remain unbiased because I want these reports to be just true information, real information without an agenda. Obviously, we are, brokers, we sell real estate, but we don't have to, we're not in a position where we have to sell because we do believe in cash flow. So I want to always look at this data from a non-biased perspective. And it keeps coming back to there's just going to be this increased demand for rentals. There already was, and now that could even be more true. So going back to these slides, where is this growth? Where are these people living? And I just found this slide. I thought this was interesting of population growth over time. And it's a much longer than this, but I just went to the 60s, basically till now. And you can see the Northeast kind of shrinking, the Midwest a bit too, but then holding steady over this past decade, and then the South really growing. and the West growing as well. So that was interesting. And it kind of coincides with what John Burns Real Estate Consulting was saying in their projections till 2025, that most of the growth, and both for homeowners and renters, would be in the Southeast, which you can see there on the map of the United States, and then Texas, Florida, the Southwest, Northeast, California, Midwest, and then of course Northwest, sort of at the bottom there of growth, with a projected household growth of 5 million more homeowners and 7 million more renters. I think that's going to change. I think we're going to see more on the side of renters given what's happening. Again, a lot of people didn't see a virus just shutting down the economy like this. A lot of us saw that something would come, but again, not something this dramatic. So again, why would they be moving to the Southwest? Already, it was because, in my opinion, affordability, lower property taxes, lower state taxes, and job growth. So that very likely could continue. I already showed those. Now, when we came into this, we were sitting in a very interesting situation where we had an undersupply of housing. And so here's a slide again from Metro Study. And right around here, we were right about here when all of this started, which is quite an undersupply. I don't know what I said before. I hope I didn't say it wrong, but we have an undersupply of housing. And that was the headline news. That was the problem, is that all this population growth, prices going up, not enough builders creating new supply, definitely not able to provide affordable homes that people could afford. You know, people with incomes not going up as fast as home prices and asset values. This was already a major problem. And according to, again, Metro Study, this was going to be a problem for many more years. And it was basically over the next couple of years going to top out of lack of supply, and then slowly builders would bring more inventory online. And it wouldn't be till, 2023, 2024 that we'd come into equilibrium with supply and demand on housing, both for rentals and new homes. So this was just driving up rents, driving up home prices with lack of inventory, and really exacerbating the problem. So here we are today with so many job losses. The question is, will we remain undersupplied? Will we be oversupplied? How might this play out? And that's something we won't really know till we get there. But based on these slides, we just might get to that equilibrium a little faster than expected, which could actually be a good thing. It could be a good thing for a few reasons. People maybe home prices won't. Let's take it from the homeowner side and the renter side. Prices won't go up so dramatically. There'll be more options for renters, and life will be a little more affordable. On the flip side, for the landlord and for home sellers and flippers, and for builders, there may not be, as much of a need for new inventory, at least, depending on how this plays out. But again, when we came into this, what we knew is that so many people had locked in low mortgages, like super low payments on their mortgages, low interest rates. And over time, over the past 10 years, the value of their homes, people who were able to buy a house, they had a lot of equity. So even if values in the housing market go down, it would have to go down substantially for people to be wanting to walk away from their properties. So we're walking into this in a very, very different way than we did 10 years ago, or not even 10 years ago. And let's see, that was 2007, really. It's about 13 years ago. A lot of home equity, low debt, people who really had to qualify for loans. And if you look closely, people had to have really good FICO scores, good jobs, reserves. So people in those loans were pretty solid for the most part. But then there was this mass group of people that weren't able to qualify and were forced to rent. So this is basically the breakdown of that in rental households. And single family was about 16 million households, and multifamily about 28. And the median income for multifamily tended to be lower than single family. And what we were already seeing, again, before getting into this, was that apartment rents in top markets were really overvalued. And for those of you in the apartment world, I'm sure you know, it was really difficult to find any apartments that penciled. Very difficult. A lot of people were trying to find value add, and they could only make the numbers work if they really over leveraged and did, planned on raising the rent somehow, trying to find creative ways to raise rents through some kind of renovation or creative ways. I don't know, paying for parking or adding units, and just trying to find ways to increase rents. But unfortunately, I think a lot of people did overpay. Now they're not maybe going to see those rental increases, and that could be a big problem for some people, again, who over leveraged and overpaid for apartments. And again, this shows the East Bay was one of those considered the most overvalued. The Nashville, Miami, Sacramento, San Jose, the least Indianapolis, Jacksonville, Washington, Austin. So again, this slide is really great at showing that there is no such thing as a housing market. There's no such thing as an apartment market. It's all different. It just depends on the metro. It depends on that part of the metro. It depends on what the jobs are in that area, what the demographics are. So when you see headlines like the one we just saw, just came out last week from the National Apartment, I don't know, I just did a podcast on it, saying that paid rents were down 30%. It's like, oh, that's really general. You can't make a generalization like that and have it hold any weight. First of all, it was only about 10% off of what it normally would be at that time. And it's taking an average of the country, and that's just not useful because every metro area is in a different part of its cycle, and every apartment is different, charges different rents, has different type of demographics within its apartment. So anyway, my guess is that in the next year or so, within the next year or so, we might see some opportunity to buy apartments at discounted prices. So that could be an opportunity. Oh, here's that. Yes, the National Multifamily Housing Council. This article came out and freaked out a lot of people. And of course, when one article comes out, then all the other news outlets start repeating the same story. And it's like, oh, 1/3 of US apartment renters didn't make April rent payments. And it's just not as dramatic. So you can see down here by the numbers, 69% of tenants paid some rent between April 1st through the 5th, which is down from 81%. But you have to remember, people don't always pay on time. That's always the case, but that doesn't mean they're not going to pay. Maybe they're on a payment plan and they're going to pay halfway through the month when they get their next check or when they get their stimulus check. So again, don't pay too much attention to these kinds of headlines that are meant to scare you.